All right, everyone, did you know that when a multi-billion-dollar corporation that's trying to rebrand an entire franchise has difficulty doing so because it rebrands the entire franchise? Did you know that if the efforts aren't completely successful, it's the result of evil, bigoted Russian trolls that, for some reason, they think that a proper strategy for defeating the United States is to start people shitposting about a Star Wars movie? That is indeed the claim that's being made here. I'm not joking. I wish that I was. This is exactly the kind of reports you got back in maybe the 50s and 60s with relation to some of the crazier claims of communism. Now, of course, always there is a kernel of truth to what spawns a moral panic. It is then blown slowly out of proportion. The claims regarding it get more and more spurious, more and more obviously false. Little bits of the moral panic begin spinning off and affecting things that don't really have that much to do with the original claim. For instance, with regards to the Russia moral panic, the original claim was that Russians were attempting to influence they were trying to hack voting machines or do something with regards to the U.S. election in 2016. No evidence, by the way, of this was ever offered. The Mueller probe in 2 years still hasn't uncovered any tangible evidence that happened. The claim, therefore, because the original claim is false, and because there's a driving impetus for the claim to be held up, it changes. It becomes malleable. What you now have is, well, some Russian nationals bought Facebook ads. Russia's trying to start debate over Star Wars. The idea was that it was impossible that it could possibly be organic, that a homegrown audience would actually simply dislike the movie. Like that the more vicious comments had to come from Russia. Now, let me ask something. With regards to this, since it has nothing to do with politics, is there any real compelling reason to believe that there might not be Russians who are actual Star Wars fans that simply didn't like The Last Jedi? And now looking through it, of course, and saying with the rebooted Star Wars franchise, it's hit and miss. Some of the elements are pretty good, like the effects are obviously better than like Episode 1 and stuff, and I made a video on this. But then you've lost something of the original sort of franchise as well, at least the original trilogy. I'm in the minority. I liked Episode 1. I didn't really have a problem with it. Episode 2 I didn't like very much. Although the first 30 minutes is worth some basic character development. There's not a whole lot of action. When you get the explosions and stuff, Jango Fett's okay. That part holds up. That and Anakin being totally cringy, I actually thought was great because, it becomes comic at some point. But with regards to Last Jedi, Rogue One, some of these new movies that are being created, how is it that people can look at this like a bunch of sheep and just sort of passively absorb and say, okay, yeah, Russians were the reason why it got low ratings? So maybe it's because the movie did not play up to certain demographics that really like Star Wars. Maybe it's Disney's trying to make it fundamentally a different franchise from what it really was before. From the direction that Lucas even took it with the original trilogy, or certainly with the so-called prequels with 1, 2, and 3. He was going into more again, character development. With the newer movies, you've got more of that Disney-style feel. Disney has a very formulaic way in which to make movies. Because it's time-tested, it works. It happens not to be the same basic formula that Lucas had in mind. If you look at the original trilogy, the idea of politics, in the sense of what you would consider modern so-called progressivism, which Disney is indeed trying to inject to some degree in Star Wars, is really absent in the original trilogy. Really, when you look at it, what are the political messages? The political messages are distrustful of authority, not, hey, we need powerful figures to lead us sort of thing. It actually is, it almost gets away from that and says everyone is inherently corrupted by, the dark. What is the dark side? It's like basically will to power, you could call it, or something. It's almost a little bit libertarian. It certainly has democratic Republican overtones in the most literal sense. The idea is the concentration of power became a problem. Almost it was more a worse problem in the long term than having a weaker sort of a federation or something, a weaker republic. Disney has left all the political banter, maybe the classically liberal elements behind, in favor of lots of sword fighting and special effects. Insofar as that goes, they got it absolutely right with all of the recent stuff. Especially, I liked Rogue One the best. I thought it was actually quite a good movie, and it was a story that needed to be told. But the idea that someone could simply dislike it, some people really They've stopped watching Star Wars just because Lucas is no longer leading it. They watched, with Episode 7, they immediately got turned off by it because it was a rip-off of A New Hope, which it was. It was literally a rip-off of A New Hope. Disney repackaged it in order to rebrand and lay the groundwork for more original content. It kind of worked, because, unlike, you look at the Ghostbusters reboot, which was a total fucking flop. It was a fiscal failure. Nobody gives a shit about it anymore. It's no longer even basically a canonical Ghostbusters movie. Nobody cared. And remember when that happened and they tried to say it was all sexists? They're doing the same thing now. It's an apology for a movie that basically didn't do as well as they wanted, didn't get universal acclaim. The thing is, it kind of worked. Compared to like Ghostbusters, they learned from the failure that had been that, by making sure to reintroduce some of the older characters, like Chewbacca is still there. Luke, makes an appearance. They take Han Solo, and even if you're killing him off, you have him there to sort of help guide a new cast into the franchise. But there are also a lot of people that fucking hated that. They're like, hey, Han Solo's dead. Luke's dead. All these people are dead. Everyone's dead. And now they're doing CGI Tarkin and shit like that. It's getting a little too weird, I think, for them. The original fans of the franchise like it, I think, less than the new generation. This, by the way, happened with the prequels. Basically, people who were young when Episode 1 came out, it was like, wow, pod racing, N64, Legos and stuff, sort of that style of culture. But for people who primarily liked the original trilogy, and remember, like my dad or someone, didn't like it as much. I found it enjoyable. Now, by Episode 2, it was like, that one a little bit less. But Episode 1, it did spawn sort of that, revival Star Wars subculture. If it hadn't been for the fact that they were at least fiscally successful, Disney wouldn't be relaunching it now. I just think Disney is overloading people, too. In a fairly short period of time, they've made quite a few new Star Wars movies. The Han Solo movie and Rogue One on the side that are, fill-in material. They'll probably at some point do Shadows of the Empire. But the fact is that has nothing to do with Russian trolls. The idea of blaming so many people just want to blame every failure they have on Russia at this point. This is the same kind of mentality as you had back in like 50s or 60s. Oh, the machine in the factory blew up. It was Russian espionage. You have sort of that weird feeling, those sort of claims that were made at that time. The government, every time it bungled something, it was Russia. Russian infiltrators, Russian saboteurs. It wasn't that we just sometimes are inept. We did something wrong. Oh, we're having a scandal? Let's talk about Russia some more. It's very important that we do that to deflect. I see the same thing happening here. So I would say, despite the fact that the Star Wars reboot is at least marginally successful, I mean, Rogue One was honestly a very good movie for the most part. Despite the fact that Disney could be doing worse at times with it, the fact is that a lot of people don't like the rebooting. They don't like it. They don't like Star Wars anymore because they think Disney's taking it in the wrong direction. Much like people who didn't like the prequels. But George Lucas didn't come out and say, well, you fucking Russians trying to ruin Star Wars for me. He didn't do that. He's like, oh, yeah, in retrospect, yeah, there's some branding issues there. Maybe there were some problems with CGI. Maybe I should have waited an extra year to make sure that, the droids actually stood up a little bit. Maybe I jumped the gun a little. By the way, if he'd done that, he'd still be making Star Wars. He'd be the one in charge. Apparently, he wanted to fixate heavily on metachlorians, these little life forms, and sort of go that route. That's been largely scrapped by Disney. Most people think that's a wise decision. I don't know. I didn't really care. The idea that it would be like kind of life forms or energies or something, who cares? That's about all. Peace out.